Picture this: a young boy, rejected by his father, mocked by his tribe, cast out into the wilderness with his mother. Fast forward 20 years, and that same boy has become the most feared military genius Africa has ever seen, commanding an army of 50,000 warriors, revolutionizing warfare, and building an empire that would span thousands of square miles. His enemies whispered his name in terror. His warriors would die for him without hesitation. And his story? It's more epic than any Hollywood movie could ever capture. This is the story of Shaka Zulu, the man who transformed a small, insignificant clan into the most powerful military force in southern Africa. The warrior who invented combat tactics, still studied in military academies today. The leader whose reign was so brutal, so brilliant, and so legendary that historians still debate whether he was a visionary genius or a bloodthirsty tyrant. By the end of this episode, you'll understand why Shaka Zulu wasn't just a warrior. He was a force of nature that changed the course of African history forever. So buckle up, because we're about to dive deep into a story of betrayal, revenge, innovation, and absolute power. Let's start at the beginning, because Shaka's origin story reads like ancient mythology. Born around 1787 in what is now KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, Shaka Zulu entered the world under a cloud of scandal. His father, Senzangakona, was a minor chieftain of the Zulu clan. And I say minor because at this time, the Zulus were nobody special. Just one small clan among hundreds in the region. His mother, Nandi, was a princess from a neighboring Langini clan. But here's where it gets messy. Nandi became pregnant before the official marriage ceremonies were completed. This was considered a massive disgrace in Zulu culture. When tribal elders confronted Senzangakona about the pregnancy, he claimed it was just Ishaka, a made-up intestinal condition caused by beetles. But when the baby was born, they named him Shaka, essentially naming him after his father's lie. Imagine growing up with that as your name's origin story. The relationship between Senzangakona and Nandi fell apart quickly. When Shaka was just 6 years old, mother and son were banished from the Zulu clan. They wandered from place to place, seeking shelter and protection. Everywhere they went, young Shaka was mocked and humiliated. Other children bullied him mercilessly. He was called names, excluded from games, reminded constantly that he was an outcast, a child of shame. But here's what makes this story fascinating. Every single one of those humiliations was forging something inside Shaka. Every insult, every rejection, every moment of suffering was building in rage, an ambition, and a determination that would one day reshape an entire region. Eventually, Nandi and Shaka found refuge with the Mthethwa clan, ruled by a powerful chief named Dingiswayo. And this is where Shaka's transformation begins. At around 16 years old, Shaka was conscripted into Dingiswayo's army as part of his mandatory service. This wasn't unusual. All young men served in the military. But what was unusual was what Shaka did with this opportunity. Now, to understand Shaka's military genius, you need to understand what warfare looked like in southern Africa before he came along. Traditional combat was almost ceremonial. Warriors would line up at a distance from each other, throw spears from far away, shout insults, maybe a few people would get hurt, and then everyone would go home. It was more about posturing and displays of courage than actual killing. The weapons reflected this. Warriors carried multiple long throwing spears called assegai with thin shafts, designed to be thrown and retrieved. Shaka looked at the system and thought, this is absolutely ridiculous. He began experimenting with combat techniques that were revolutionary for his time. First, he developed what he called the ikuwa, a short, broad-bladed stabbing spear with a thick shaft. The name ikuwa supposedly comes from the sucking sound it made when pulled out of an enemy's body. Pleasant, right? But this weapon changed everything. Instead of throwing spears from a distance, Shaka's method was to get up close and personal. Close quarters combat. Brutal, efficient, deadly. But the ikuwa was just the beginning. Shaka also redesigned the shield. He made it larger and fitted it with a handle that allowed a warrior to hook an opponent's shield to the left, exposing their entire right side to a fatal stab. He drilled his warriors endlessly on this technique until it was muscle memory. Then came the physical conditioning. Shaka believed that warriors needed to be fast, tireless, and tough. So he made his soldiers train barefoot. He personally led brutal marches, sometimes covering 50 miles in a day over rough terrain, without shoes. Any warrior who complained was executed on the spot. Sounds harsh? That was just the beginning. Shaka also invented new battlefield formations. The most famous was the buffalo horn formation, Pondo Zankamo in Zulu. Here's how it worked. The army was divided into 4 parts. The chest was the main force that engaged the enemy head-on. The horns were 2 flanking units that would encircle the enemy from both sides. And the loins were reserves that sat with their backs to the battle until needed, preventing them from getting caught up in battle fever too early. This tactic was devastatingly effective. Enemies would engage what they thought was the main force, only to suddenly find themselves surrounded and cut off from retreat. It was psychological warfare, combined with tactical brilliance. Shaka's reputation as a warrior grew rapidly. He became one of Dingiswayo's most celebrated fighters, leading military campaigns and proving his tactics in battle after battle. But Shaka wasn't just building a military career. He was building something much bigger. He was preparing for the moment when he could return to the Zulu clan, not as a rejected outcast, but as a conqueror. In 1816, everything changed. Senzangakona, Shaka's father who had rejected and banished him, died. The succession should have been straightforward. Senzangakona's legitimate son, Sigujana, became chief of the Zulu clan. But Shaka had other plans. With the backing of Dingiswayo, who had grown to see Shaka as a valuable ally, Shaka moved quickly. Historical accounts vary on exactly what happened next, but the end result is clear. Sigujana was assassinated, almost certainly on Shaka's orders. Some accounts say Shaka had him killed by hired assassins. Others suggest it was more direct. Either way, within a month of his father's death, Shaka had seized control of the Zulu clan. Now remember, at this point, the Zulus were still relatively insignificant. The clan numbered maybe 1,500 people. Shaka was chief of a small tribe in a region full of much more powerful groups. Most men would have been satisfied with just consolidating their position. Shaka was not most men. He immediately began transforming Zulu society according to his military vision. Every aspect of Zulu life became organized around warfare and expansion. He restructured the age grade system into Amabutho, military regiments that lived together, trained together, and fought together. Warriors were forbidden from marrying until they had proven themselves in battle and received permission from Shaka personally, usually not until their mid-30s. This created a standing army of young, unmarried warriors with no family obligations, completely devoted to military service and their chief. The discipline was extreme. One story tells of Shaka ordering a regiment to march off a cliff to prove their loyalty. They did it. He called them back at the last second, but the message was clear: absolute obedience or death. Shaka also eliminated traditional limits on warfare. Before Shaka, defeated enemies would typically be absorbed peacefully or allowed to flee. Shaka introduced total warfare. Defeated clans faced a choice: complete assimilation into the Zulu nation or complete annihilation. There was no middle ground. Survivors were scattered, their social structures destroyed, their identities erased. They became Zulu or they became nothing. Between 1816 and 1820, Shaka fought campaign after campaign, each one expanding Zulu territory and power. The Langini clan, the same clan that had mocked and humiliated him as a child, conquered. Their leaders? Executed. Shaka personally identified every person who had wronged him or his mother during their years of wandering. Those people were impaled on the sharpened stakes of their own crawl fences. His vengeance was systematic and terrifying, but it was also strategic. Each act of extreme violence sent a message to other clans: submission or destruction. By 1820, something unprecedented was happening in southern Africa. What started as one rejected boy's quest for revenge had become a tsunami of violence and displacement that would reshape the entire region. Historians called Mfecane the crushing or the scattering. Shaka's armies were now unstoppable. Clan after clan fell before the Zulu military machine. But here's where it gets really complex. The violence created a domino effect. Clans fleeing from Zulu conquest would attack and displace other clans, who would in turn displace others. It became a cascading wave of warfare, migration, and chaos that affected millions of people across southern and eastern Africa. Some fleeing groups became powerful forces themselves. Mfecane, one of Shaka's former generals, broke away and founded the Ndebele Kingdom in what is now Zimbabwe. The Ngoni people migrated as far north as Tanzania. The Mfecane's effects were felt across thousands of miles. Estimates of the death toll vary wildly. Some historians suggest between 1 and 2 million people died during this period, though these numbers are hotly debated. What's certain is that by 1824, Shaka Zulu Kingdom controlled approximately 11,500 square miles and had a standing army of around 50,000 warriors. Shaka's capital at Bulawayo became a center of power. He held court there, dispensing justice, planning military campaigns, and hosting visitors including European traders and explorers who were beginning to arrive on the African coast. These European accounts provide some of our most detailed descriptions of Shaka, though they must be read carefully. They're written from a colonial perspective and often exaggerate for dramatic effect. But they paint a picture of a ruler who was simultaneously sophisticated and brutal, strategic and paranoid, visionary and tyrannical. By all accounts, Shaka was physically imposing, tall, powerfully built, and radiating authority. He was also intellectually curious, questioning European visitors extensively about their technology, their governments, their weapons. He was fascinated by firearms, but decided they weren't practical for style of warfare. They were too slow to reload, too unreliable in wet conditions. But success and absolute power were changing Shaka. Or maybe they were revealing something that had always been there, forged in those childhood years of humiliation and rejection. Shaka never married, never produced an heir. Some historians suggest this was strategic, eliminating potential succession disputes. Others suggest deeper psychological reasons, possibly related to his traumatic relationship with his father. Whatever the reason, it meant Shaka's grip on power depended entirely on fear and military dominance, with no dynastic legitimacy to fall back on. The executions became more frequent, more arbitrary. Sneezing during a ceremony? Execution. Not showing sufficient grief at a funeral? Execution. Speaking out of turn? Execution. The paranoia was growing. Then, in October 1827, something happened that would push Shaka over the edge entirely. His mother, Nandi, died. Remember, Nandi had been Shaka's one constant source of love and support through all those years of exile and humiliation. Her death devastated him, and his grief took a dark, almost incomprehensible form. Shaka declared a year of mourning, but this wasn't ordinary mourning. He ordered that no crops should be planted. No milk, a staple food, could be consumed. Any woman who became pregnant during the mourning period would be executed along with her husband. And in the most shocking decree of all, Shaka ordered the execution of approximately 7,000 people whom he deemed hadn't shown sufficient grief at his mother's death. The kingdom descended into chaos. Famine loomed because no planting had been done. The people were terrified, never knowing what might trigger Shaka's rage next. Even his most loyal warriors and advisors began to realize that their king had become unstable, dangerous not just to enemies but to the Zulu people themselves. In September 1828, less than a year after his mother's death, Shaka sent the bulk of his army north on a military campaign. With most of his military might away from the capital, a small group of conspirators saw their opportunity. The conspiracy was led by Shaka's half-brothers, Dingane and Mlangana, along with Shaka's personal attendant, Mbofa. On September 22, 1828, while Shaka was receiving gifts from a trading delegation, the assassin struck. The account of Shaka's death vary, but most agree on the basic facts. He was stabbed multiple times by his half-brothers and Mbofa. According to legend, as he lay dying, Shaka spoke his final words. "Brothers, why do you kill me? What have I done?" Then, prophetically, "You think you will rule, but the white people are coming and they will rule you." Whether Shaka actually said those words, we can't know for certain, but they turned out to be eerily accurate. Dingane took power after Shaka's death, But within a decade, the Zulu kingdom would face an existential threat far greater than any African rival: European colonialism. Shaka's body was buried in a standing position, according to Zulu custom for great chiefs, an unknown location that remains a mystery to this day. He was roughly 41 years old. He had ruled for just 12 years. But in those 12 years, he had transformed the political and military landscape of Southern Africa forever. So what do we make of Shaka Zulu? How should history remember him? This is where things get really complicated, because Shaka's legacy has been fought over for nearly 2 centuries. To some, especially within Zulu culture and among many Africans, Shaka is a hero, a brilliant military innovator who unified his people, created a powerful kingdom, and stood as a symbol of African strength and resistance in the face of European colonialism. Streets, airports, and institutions across Southern Africa bear his name. He's celebrated as a founding father, a genius, a warrior king who proved that African civilizations could rival any in the world for sophistication and military prowess. To others, Shaka was a tyrant, a paranoid dictator whose wars of conquest killed hundreds of thousands, whose brutal executions terrorized his own people, and whose autocratic rule left the Zulu kingdom vulnerable and unstable after his death. Both perspectives contain truth. Shaka was a military genius. His tactical innovations were brilliant and are still studied today. He did create a powerful, unified kingdom from scattered clans. He was a strong leader who commanded absolute loyalty and transformed Zulu society. But he was also brutal beyond measure. The executions, the terror, the total warfare, these weren't just military necessity. They revealed a capacity for cruelty that went beyond strategic calculation into something darker. Perhaps the most honest assessment is this: Shaka was a product of his time and his circumstances, amplified to an extreme degree. He grew up in a violent world where strength was everything and weakness meant death. He was traumatized, rejected, humiliated, and he transformed that trauma into world-changing ambition. He took the military practices of his era and perfected them into something devastatingly effective. And he wielded power with the absolute conviction of someone who had fought tooth and nail for every scrap of respect he'd ever received. In military terms, his legacy is undeniable. The tactics he developed influenced African warfare for generations. Some historians even draw direct lines between Shaka's buffalo horn formation and tactics used by military forces worldwide. The Zulu military tradition he established created a warrior culture so powerful that, even after Shaka's death, Zulu armies would go on to achieve stunning victories against technologically superior British forces, most famously the Battle of Iselin in 1879, where Zulu warriors overwhelmed a British invasion force. In cultural terms, Shaka became a mythical figure, part history, part legend. Songs, stories, poems, and now films and books continue to tell and retell his story, each generation finding new meaning in the tale of the outcast boy who became a king. Here's what strikes me most about Shaka's story. It's a reminder that history's greatest figures are rarely simple heroes or villains. They're complex, contradictory, shaped by forces beyond their control, and by choices entirely their own. Shaka Zulu was abandoned and humiliated, and he responded by conquering an empire. He was brilliant and paranoid, visionary and brutal. He united thousands and killed thousands. He built something extraordinary and ruled it with terror. He changed history and was consumed by it. His story raises uncomfortable questions that echo through history. When does strength become tyranny? When does justified vengeance become senseless cruelty? Can we celebrate tactical genius while condemning moral horror? How do we measure a life lived with such extreme highs and lows? These aren't academic questions. They're relevant every time we encounter leaders who promise strength and unity, but deliver violence and oppression. They're relevant every time we try to understand how trauma shapes individuals and how individuals shape history. Shaka Zulu's legacy isn't just about what he did nearly 200 years ago in Southern Africa. It's about how we understand power, leadership, trauma, revenge, and the complex, often dark relationship between all of them. So here's my question for you, and I really want you to think about this one. If you had grown up as Shaka did, rejected by your father, mocked by your community, forced to watch your mother suffer because of the circumstances of your birth, and then you were given a chance at absolute power and revenge, what would you have done differently? Would you have been more merciful? Or would the same forces that shaped Shaka have shaped you too? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think. And if you found this story as fascinating as I did, if you want more deep dives into the lives of history's most complex and compelling figures, then do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. We're building a community of people who want to understand history, not just as a list of dates and facts, but as a collection of incredible human stories that still have something to teach us today. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next episode.